want you to picture a specific place in southern Poland. It's a field, mostly weeds, all gray and sort of desolate. And in the middle of it, looming over everything, is this 20-foot structure made from old railroad ties.
It's a cross.
It's a cross.
Yeah.
And it stands right at the edge of Auschwitz, the death camp, where over 1 million Jews were murdered.
And that image, it just hits you immediately. There's this massive dissonance. For any Christian, that cross is supposed to be the ultimate symbol of love, of redemption.
But there, casting a shadow over the gas chambers.
For a Jewish survivor or their family, that is not a symbol of love. It is the symbol of the very worldview that, in their eyes, paved the road for their destruction.
That clash, that deep, irreconcilable conflict between the cross as love and the cross as terror, that is the absolute heartbeat of what we're talking about today.
Oh, it really is.
And before we go any further, we should mention that you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's NotebookLM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis. We are here to break down James Carroll's massive and, let's be honest, very controversial work, Constantine's Sword, the Church and the Jews, a History.
And history is almost too small a word for it.
Ugh.
Carroll himself calls it a biography of a tragedy. This is a man who was a Catholic priest, he's a National Book Award winner, and he is essentially putting his own church on trial.
But he's doing it as an insider, as someone who loves the faith.
Oh, absolutely. It feels less like an attack and more like what he calls an examination of conscience. His whole argument, the central thesis, is that the extermination of Jews in World War II was not some freak accident. It didn't just appear out of nowhere with a few pagan Nazis.
He's saying it was the end of a long road.
The logical culmination, in his words, of 2,000 years of theological hostility that was fostered and protected by the church itself.
That is an incredibly heavy accusation.
Yeah.
And to really get it, we have to go right back to that cross in the field at Auschwitz. This wasn't just a metaphor he used, right? This was a real geopolitical crisis.
Oh, it was huge. The cross at Auschwitz controversy in the 80s and 90s, it all started simply enough. That big cross was used for a mass by Pope John Paul II back in 1979, a symbol of Polish suffering, Polish pride.
Okay.
But then in 1984, a group of Carmelite nuns decided to move into an old building right at the camp's gate, a building the Nazis actually used to store the Zyklon B gas canisters.
And their intention was to pray there.
Yes, to pray for the souls of the dead. And from a Catholic perspective, that's a beautiful, noble gesture. But as Carroll lays out, Jewish leadership saw it as a profound violation.
Their slogan was, "Leave our dead alone."
That was it. They felt the church was trying to Christianize Auschwitz, that it was co-opting this uniquely Jewish suffering and making it all about the church instead.
And Carroll describes this scene where it just gets ugly. Protests, shouting. I mean, there's a moment in the book that just sticks with you. A local Polish boy starts screaming at the Jewish protesters.
They crucified our God. They killed Jesus.
That's the one. And in that moment, the mask just slips completely.
Right. Because that scream shows this was never about a property dispute in the 1980s. That kid is channeling an accusation that is 2,000 years old. He's not seeing protesters. He's seeing them through the ancient lens of the Christ killer myth.
And it spiraled. Radical Catholics planting hundreds of smaller crosses to defend the big one. People planting fake explosives. It became a war.
A war of memory. That's what it was. For the Pope, the cross-honored Polish martyrs, and we can't forget thousands of Catholic Poles died there too. But for the Jewish community, the cross represented the very institution that had spent centuries marking them as other, as outsiders.
And Carroll makes this so personal. He connects this giant historical conflict to a small story from his own childhood with his friend Peter Seligman.
It's a heartbreaking little story. Carroll grew up. His best friend was Peter, a Jewish boy. Inseparable. And then one day, he calls it the country club moment. He invites Peter to go swimming at the local club.
And Peter just looks at him and says,
"It's a club and we're Jews." He just knew. He knew he wasn't welcome. And for Carroll, that was the moment it clicked. He realized that for his best friend, the word Jewish was basically a synonym for unwelcome.
it's the same DNA. The exclusion of a country club and the exclusion of a death camp.
It's the same cultural logic, just taken to its most horrific extreme.
So how did we get here? I mean, how do you get from a Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth to a cross looming over Auschwitz? Carroll takes us all the way back to the year 312, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Why is that specific battle the core of his whole thesis?
Because this is the moment the cross fundamentally changes its meaning. Before this, Jesus is mostly understood in a Jewish context. The cross is a symbol of a poor man executed by the Roman state. It's a symbol of shame, of suffering.
But then comes Constantine, the Roman emperor.
Right. He's fighting for control of the empire, and he claims to have a vision right before the battle. He sees a cross in the sky.
With the words, "In this sign, conquer."
Not in this sign, love.
Conquer.
That is the entire shift. Constantine puts the cross on his army's shields, on their military standards. He wins the battle, and Christianity is no longer the religion of the oppressed.
That's the religion of the empire.
And the cross becomes Constantine's sword. It's an instrument of power, of conquest.
So now if you're on the wrong side of that cross, you're not just a heretic, you're an enemy of the state.
Precisely. And that requires a new theology to justify it. If the empire is Christian, what do we do with the Jews? Why are they still around? This is where Carroll brings in Augustine of Hippo. Augustine develops what's called the witness theory.
And this is the idea that Jews shouldn't be killed, but they shouldn't be allowed to thrive either.
Essentially, yes. As the book explains it, Augustine argued that Jews must be preserved, but preserved in degradation. Their public suffering serves as a witness to the triumph of Christianity.
It's a terrifying logic. We'll keep you around, miserable, to prove how right we are.
It's a very dark logic. Don't kill them, but make their lives a living testament to our victory. It sets a very dangerous stage.
A stage for violence, even if he didn't call for it directly.
Absolutely. And once we move into the Middle Ages, things get much worse. Just look at the Crusades, 1095. Pope Urban II calls for a war to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims. But what happens first?
The Crusaders don't wait until they get to Jerusalem.
Not at all. As they march through the Rhineland and Germany, they start slaughtering entire Jewish communities. Carroll points to this chronicle, The Mainz Anonymous, which basically describes the first systematic mass murder of Jews in European history.
And this is where the story shifts from Jews are theologically wrong to something much uglier. Jews are monsters.
That's the psychological pivot. You get the rise of the blood libel, this horrific, insane conspiracy theory that Jews murder Christian children to use their blood in rituals.
It's pure fantasy, but it takes hold.
It does. And now Jews aren't just religious rivals, they're a demonic threat.
Which leads us to 1492. We always think of Columbus, but Carroll says the real story is in Spain, the Inquisition. He argues this is the moment religious hatred becomes racial hatred.
This is one of the most critical points in the book. Before the Spanish Inquisition, if you were a Jew, you could convert. You could be baptized, and you were, in theory, safe.
But Spain changed the game.
They became obsessed with this idea of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. They started believing that even the converts, the conversos, were secretly Jewish. They decided Jewishness wasn't a belief, it was in the blood. Biological.
That sounds chillingly familiar, like the Nuremberg laws.
That is exactly Carroll's point. The Inquisition basically invents the racialization of the Jewish people. They say, baptism can't fix you, your blood is tainted. And once you decide a group of people is biologically defective, well, you're on the road to the gas chambers.
It's overwhelming when you see it all stacked up. The witness theory, the blood libel, purity of blood. It's like watching a storm gather for centuries.
It is. It's incredibly heavy.
Which is actually a good moment to just pause and take a breath.
Nice.
If you are finding this kind of analysis valuable, peeling back the layers of history like this, you should really check out our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments. We do AI-powered book analyses just like this one, exploring history, psychology, philosophy.
It's a great way to keep that critical thinking muscle working. It's all about getting to the why behind the what.
Exactly. So let's jump back in. We've moved through the Inquisition, and we're heading into the modern era. You'd think the Enlightenment Voltaire reason would fix this, right?
You would hope so, but Carroll calls it the Enlightenment paradox. The deal that was offered to Jews was basically, we will grant you equality, but only if you stop being Jewish.
Assimilate or you're out.
Right. Voltaire himself wrote some viciously anti-Semitic things. He saw Judaism as a backward superstition. So this so-called emancipation was a trap. You can join the club, but you have to leave your identity at the door.
And this tension just explodes with the Dreyfus affair in France.
Yeah.
This Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, falsely accused of treason.
And guess who's leading the public charge against him? A Catholic newspaper called La Croix, which means the cross. They are pumping out anti-Semitic propaganda day after day, arguing he must be guilty because he's a Jew.
It shows that even in modern Europe, the old hatreds were just simmering right under the surface.
Waiting for a match. And then we get to the 20th century, Hitler. And the question that just hangs over this entire book, Where was the church? Specifically, where was Pope Pius XII?
Carroll calls it the surrender of German Catholicism.
He focuses so heavily on this, and the most damning moment he points to is in 1943 in Rome itself.
The deportation of the Roman Jews.
Nazis had occupied Rome. They went into the Roman ghetto, a ghetto established by the popes centuries earlier, and they started rounding people up, loading families onto trucks to be sent to Auschwitz.
And this was happening, what, right under the Pope's window?
Literally, he could see it.
And he remained silent.
Publicly, yes. No condemnation, no threat of excommunication for the Catholic soldiers helping the Nazis, nothing.
Why? That's the question that just screams at you from the page.
Carroll argues it wasn't just fear. It goes back to that theology he mentioned earlier, the seamless robe. The idea that the prime directive is to preserve the institution of the church at all costs.
So he was afraid the Nazis would destroy the church.
He was. And so he sacrificed the moral truth, the moral outcry, to save the institutional structure. The institution itself became more important than the people it was supposed to serve.
That is a devastating critique.
And Carroll contrasts that silence with the story of Edith Stein. A brilliant Jewish philosopher who converted, became a Carmelite nun. She was murdered at Auschwitz.
And the church made her a saint.
They did. But Carroll points out the uncomfortable truth. The Nazis didn't kill her because she was a Catholic nun. They didn't care about her faith. They killed her because her identity paper said she was born Jewish, because of her blood.
So by calling her a Catholic martyr, the church is kind of avoiding the real reason she died.
It feels like an attempt to baptize the tragedy, as Carroll puts it, to make it about the church's suffering instead of the church's failure. And this leads to a really important point he makes about language. He refuses to use the word Holocaust.
Really? What does he use instead?
He uses the Hebrew word Shoah. And the reason is critical. Holocaust comes from a Greek word that means burnt offering. It implies a sacrifice that is not only consumed, but is somehow pleasing to God.
Wow, I never knew that was the implication.
It's subtle, but it's there. Calling it a Holocaust hints at some dark divine mystery. Carroll rejects that completely. This was not God's will. This was man-made evil. Shoah just means catastrophe, total destruction. It implies the absence of God, not his presence.
The words we use carry so much weight we don't even realize.
That's his whole project. To look at the word, the symbols, the stories, and ask, what does this actually mean, and has it been weaponized?
So after dragging us through 2,000 years of this tragedy, where does he leave us? Is the book just a condemnation?
Surprisingly, no. It ends not with despair, but with a call to action. He wants a new Reformation. He literally calls for a Vatican III.
A third Vatican Council. What would that even look like?
He lays out a 5-point agenda. First, admit that parts of the New Testament itself have been weaponized against Jews. Acknowledge that phrases like, the Jews have been used to justify centuries of hate.
So stop reading those passages as a blanket condemnation of an entire people.
Exactly. Second, renounce Constantine's sword. The church has to get out of the business of political power. It needs to stand with the marginalized, not with emperors and dictators.
What else?
A new Christology. We need to fully embrace Jesus as a faithful Jew, not as the first Christian who rejected his own people. And finally, real repentance, not just words. He wants deep structural change.
He wants the church to finally face the Shoah without flinching.
Without trying to baptize it or hide from it. He believes that unless the church builds a permanent firewall against this ancient hatred, it will ultimately lose its soul.
It brings us right back to that image of him, James Carroll, standing at that cross. He calls himself an amateur Catholic.
He does, using the Latin root, amator one who loves. His critique comes from a place of deep love, not hate. He wants the church he loves to be worthy of its own message.
It's the criticism of a believer, not an enemy.
Precisely. But it leaves all of us with a really provocative question to think about. Can a 2,000-year-old institution actually change its DNA? Can you undo the Battle of the Milvian Bridge? Carroll seems to believe it has to try.
Because if the cross remains a sword, the tragedy just continues.
But if it can go back to being a symbol of solidarity with all who suffer, including the Jewish people, then maybe there's a different future possible.
That is a lot to process. This book forces you to really re-examine symbols you thought you understood.
It forces you to ask, what do my symbols actually mean? And who is paying the price for them?
Well, we want to thank you for listening to this analysis of Constantine's sword. It is definitely not an easy topic, but it feels like a necessary one. If you want to dig even deeper into the summary and the arguments we touched on today, just click the link on the screen for the in-depth book analysis.
And please don't forget to check out Mindful Moments and our podcasts for more conversations that push you to think critically about the world around you.
Subscribe, share, purchase via the link, and as always, think critically. We will see you next time.